Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Movements can sometimes be victims of their own success. Now, when we say that phrase for individuals or for a business, it just means that, the person has gotten so famous or so successful that there's all of these high-class problems that come along with it. And so we point to those sorts of things. A movement, in an ideological movement, a different kind of victim of its own success can happen. And what makes you successful, what you're doing as a movement, let's suppose you're looking at the homosexuality and tolerance towards homosexuality, that kind of movement. I'm not sure what the general name of that movement would have been over the last 40 to 60 years, depending on how long you count. But the virtue position at the time, and it was very controversial when it would have come out, was that, let's say, homosexuals should be treated as equals, homosexuals should be allowed to marry, whatever, all the standard equality stuff. And back in the 80s and the 70s, some of these things were indeed deeply controversial. And to state that position, it would have been a virtue position because it showed that you were a member of that community, and it was an unusual belief given the culture at the time, so not everybody had that view. That's what makes a good virtue, a membership position or a virtue position. But over time, and especially today and for quite some time, that position won. There's nearly no one left, really, maybe some old farts here and there, that don't hold that position. So as a successful movement, it can, when everybody just suddenly takes on that same virtue, the movement dissipates. It just goes away because you don't have membership signals that distinguish me from just everybody else because I won, right? Now, on the one hand, that can happen, but often it has a life of its own. As we've talked about, these movements and membership within those movements sometimes start to have an identity and other associated beliefs within their narrative that has a kind of momentum. And it's in many other ways, even though it may share this one virtue position with other things now, there's many other things that distinguish it, that make it a movement that's still distinguishable in certain ways than other movements. But to persist, it has to come up with other virtue positions that actually now still distinguish it as a member from the general community. Well, so if it's not those beliefs, those claims that distinguish it anymore, then they have to come up with other kinds of claims that are unusual or absurd or irrational sounding to the culture at the current moment. And this is what we see in the trans community, and even trans is largely accepted. It's certainly not the same as homosexuality more generally, but still it's come a long way. But what I mean is that within the trans community, which has been very well accepted relative to decades ago, because it's been so accepted, in order to be a member in whoever the residual members of this community are, one has to come up with more absurd or more out there relative to the opinions of the current populace opinions. And so trans women in women's sports is a perfect example. So this is something that's still, and I think it will always be, absurd in this case because it's just totally unfair and it's irrational and truly irrational rather than just being novel and weird relative to the current opinions of the time. And those things just constantly evolve. This is just genuinely irrational, I believe. But it happens, and this is, I think, a case where it's a victim of its success. It's gotten many or most of the wants that the community wanted. The average person would say, sure, if you want to be trans, that's fine with me. But to persist, because they won, they have to come up with other kinds of membership or virtue positions that distinguish themselves. And so this is what the community, which sometimes moves on its own, there's no central designer that says, hey, committee that says, here's our new virtue position. No, it just happens on its own. And so it's a victim in the sense that it now has this virtue position, which is just, I think, even as I've mentioned before, many in the trans community think this is ridiculous. We don't want biological men who transition to be competing against women. Women have fought for centuries, for millennia, to achieve the situation of having women's sports and it be respected and taken on its own. So these are just two nice examples of how communities, as they get success, can sometimes undermine themselves. Either they just wisp away, which is sometimes a good thing because the only reason the community was there was to achieve certain ends, and those ends were achieved. But sometimes, and I would say probably more often, we'd love to have data on this, those communities or some remnant of it continues to persist on its own. This is the organic nature of how narratives and the community members, they continue to persist because they're all friends and they're parts of these reputation networks where they are a bundle that's persisting through time. And in order to do that, a new kind of virtue position evolves, which is more absurd than what was before. And sometimes it's just genuinely irrationally absurd. And I think this is what we're seeing in that particular case. But it's a general phenomenon, something that we study at freex.group. That was your science moment.